Hi, my name is Anthony Riddle. I'm the Executive Director of the Alliance for Community Media, the organization that represents all of the public educational and government access interests in Washington, across the country, but also all the various forms of community media that we think are appropriate. It seems like last year we faced some pretty dramatic threats at the national level, both in the House and the Senate. And we really rallied. We brought a lot of folks together, both in coalitions and just our members, and the people that watch and use the PEG stations really called and made contact with their Congress people. And we fought the telephone companies to a draw. So the legislation was not able to be passed that would have sort of wrecked what you have going in Iowa right now. Unfortunately, right at the end of the year, since the telephone companies couldn't get 500 votes to get their legislation passed, they turned around and got 3 votes at the FCC and essentially got the same thing by fiat. Now the problem is that the FCC is not supposed to be making laws, they're just supposed to be implementing the laws that the Congress has already put in place. So if the Congress put a law in place in 1994 or 1984 or 1992 or whatever, that's what they're supposed to be implementing. They're not supposed to come back in 2006 and change what that law says, and essentially that's what we believe they've done. And we'll be fighting along with all the local government groups, and the TOA, League of Cities, Conference of Mayors, the counties, the governors associations. We'll be fighting in court to appeal this stay because we don't, to have this stay because we don't think they have the authority. But what it does is what pretty much what the federal legislation would have done and what some of the state legislation that's being proposed around the country might do, which is to place severe limits on the number of channels that would be available. A place like Iowa City, in which the city has chosen to negotiate for a community value that they think is important, they could very easily lose half of those channels if this law goes through. New providers, it's not a law, they've got me saying law, if this regulation takes effect, the new providers are not obligated to provide channels in the same amounts as the incumbent cable systems. Maybe more importantly, depending on how you look at it, is the funding scheme, which under the current federal legislation, the current law, the city can not only ask for 5% of the gross revenues, but they can negotiate with the provider to get monies over the 5% in support of public education or government access, institutional networks, which are the wires and lines that run between government institutions like the police department, the fire department, or for instance, cable drops to the cities, to city schools and so forth. All of these would be outlawed. I mean, you could ask for them, but they would be subtracted from the 5%. And so essentially, if you have, say, an access center which is getting that 1% that's over the 5% franchise fees, that would be subtracted from the 5%. So in essence, the access centers would be fighting even more directly with police departments for their funding. And we think this is really a problem. These companies are fit to make billions of dollars off of your land, the public right-of-way. You own the property. Your ancestors put the property together and have held it. It has a high degree of value. We just don't think that they should be allowed to come in, essentially skip negotiations with the community that they're going to operate in. It's a 90-day shot clock, meaning the city has 90 days to approve a new franchise or lose the right, which is not going to encourage these telephone companies to have any kind of good faith negotiations because they're not going to be ready in 90 days anyway. So they're not in any big hurry. They can wait the 90 days out and go to a federal franchise and not have to have consideration for what the community needs are. So I think it's a really grave threat. The real problem being right now is that in order to get a stay, you have to get a stay very quickly with the appeals court. We haven't even seen what the ruling looks like. It's a process that the public is not really invited to participate in. They vote the proposal up or down without putting it on paper. So you're asked to make comments before they vote without knowing specifically what they're going to vote on. They're not really set up to receive public phone calls. In fact, if the public started calling them today, they wouldn't be able to handle all the phone calls that came through.
Calling the FCC?
The FCC, yes.
Can you explain, is that what you're talking about, build out or last
No,
mile, drops and
No,
wires?
no. A couple of different issues, and I'm glad you brought those up. Build out is like a remedy against discrimination, meaning the new companies might want to just come in and say, well, it's only a value to us to serve this well-off neighborhood or this area that's dense, and we don't want to build into this other area. And so then you have like the incumbent cable operator who's already there. They've got to compete. They've had to build out your whole city. They've had to. That doesn't mean everybody in your city has cable, but everybody in your city has cable passing close enough for them to opt for it. But the new one doesn't have to do that. So that's going to drive competition into the parts of town that everybody thinks are more lucrative. You can conceivably, under the way this is written, you can conceivably have them lower the price in the richer part of town to get those customers and make up the difference by raising the price in the poorer part of town where they don't want to serve. So in other words, like if you have a cable company and a telephone company going head to head in this one small section, that might drive the prices down in that section. But there's nothing in the rules to keep the cable company from turning around and raising the prices in the other section that's not getting the competition in order to make up the difference. That's the build out issue. The proposal by AT&T doesn't even include very much upgrade to the existing system. In fact, in the poorer areas, they're proposing to deliver their system over existing phone lines, twisted pair, so you're not even getting the benefits. So the whole thing has been set up, to look like this will create competition, this will lower prices, when really, how can you say allowing Ma Bell to reform and not only run telephone, but also run internet and television in your community is somehow creating competition? It doesn't create competition, it's just this doublespeak that's constantly being used. The fact of the matter is, the reason this is taking place is it's cheaper for AT&T or Verizon to line the pockets of politicians, legally, the legal way, not accusing, but it's easier for them to do that than it is for them to do what they ought to. They can make more money, they can save more money by getting these really awful regulations passed. And that's what's happening. You're going to end up with one company controlling all the information going into and coming out of your house. They're going to be able to decide under their terms what they allow through on the internet, what they can block, what television programs you can watch, where you get your information, who you talk to. They'll be able to, these are the same companies that turned over all of your information to the spy agencies without subpoenas, and so we're just going to lay down and turn over our whole communication system. Even if you're going to have that kind of lack of communication, lack of competition, then one of the remedies ought to be PEG, Public Educational and Government Access, institutional networks. If you're going to have one company running the whole network, you got to chop out a little piece and let the public have that to have its discourse. Because when we want to come back and talk about this 5 years from now and say, this was a bad idea, it didn't work, we want to change things, where are you going to do it? Are they going to have you talking on their communication system about them? Not going to happen. So not trying to sound like it's code red or anything, but I think it really is. It's code red not for PEG, but for democracy. That if we proceed down this path the way we're going for another couple of years, we will reach a point of no return, because you can't change a system that you can't talk with your neighbors about. That's the bottom line.
AT&T just came out and said 2 years. We'll be internet neutral for 2 years.
What
does that mean?
Well, first of all, that's another way of saying we won't be internet neutral in 2 years. After 2 years, we won't be. But all that aside, I don't think that they've declared any internet neutrality. They created an exemption for anything that they want to call IPTV. Since IPTV is their creation, they can define any of the internet stuff as being IPTV. But secondly, I'm not a technical person, but having read that agreement, one of the things that they say is we will guarantee that we will not charge more or mess with the signal from the person's home to the first switch. Well, the first switch just means like the signal gets to their building. It doesn't have anything to do with what happens after that. So that, for instance, if the so-called internet, the big backbone where everything is going, if there's even a 1 foot piece that goes from that first switch to the internet and they sell that to a subsidiary, well, AT&T is not interfering with that, right? And so that doesn't constitute net neutrality interference under their, in other words, they have 1 million attorneys who wrote that language very carefully to suit their needs. I don't think they give a darn. You know, the other part of it is, let's talk about power. How does power work? You got two little companies, AT&T and Bell South, and you're big enough to force them through public pressure to come to this agreement to get the merger to take place. Once the merger takes place, they're twice as big. And so they can then start using that pressure to eliminate the constrictions that they imposed on themselves before the merger. I just think the only remedy is to keep them separate, to keep the Bell companies broken up the way that they were, to ensure localism by maintaining the community's right to negotiate the use of its rights of way, whether for communications or for public toilets or for public newsstands. The community you live in has the right to say what's going to be on the sidewalk or under the sidewalk or on a pole over the sidewalk, and the federal government should not be messing around with that. I don't think that Iowa City should look like San Francisco or New York City. You have a distinct character. You should have a role in determining the character of your city, and it shouldn't be usurped by three people who are going to get industry jobs when they leave the FCC.